The day my world shattered, it didn't begin with a bang, but with the chillingly quiet click of a courtroom door. They dragged me there to publicly renounce me, to stand before the world and brand me an imposter in the family I once called my own. They never imagined that the one person who could silence their lies wasn't just any judge. He was my last hope, a man who held a secret that would resurrect my life from the ashes. The gavel was about to fall, not just on a legal case, but on my entire existence. They wanted me erased, a ghost in their perfect family portrait, but they made one colossal mistake. They brought their perfectly manicured lies into his courtroom, and in doing so, they woke a part of his past he thought was buried forever. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. Helps a lot. For the first 10 years of my life, my universe was confined to the quiet, sterile corridors of St. Jude's Home for Children. It wasn't a terrible place. The walls were painted a cheerful, if slightly faded, yellow, and the women who worked there did their best with tired smiles and gentle hands. But it was a place of transience, a revolving door of hopeful children and hesitant adults. I was one of the constants, a permanent fixture like the scuffed-up rocking horse in the playroom. My name was Ilara. The only possession that was truly mine was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, its surface worn smooth from the countless nights I clutched it, its familiar shape a small anchor in an ocean of loneliness. It was the only artifact from a past I couldn't remember, found with me on the cold stone steps of a church when I was just an infant. Then, at the age of 10, Richard and Susan Davies glided into my life, looking as though they had stepped directly out of a glossy magazine. Susan, with her immaculate blonde hair coiled perfectly at her neck and a string of pearls that seemed to glow, smelled of lavender and something else I couldn't place then, but now know was the crisp scent of money. Richard was tall and distinguished, with a kind-looking smile that was practiced and perfect, but never managed to reach his eyes. They wanted a daughter, they announced, their voices smooth and confident. Their eyes scanned the room, passing over the other children before landing on me, with my wild, dark curly hair and big, desperate, hopeful eyes. They picked me. The day I left St. Jude's, I remember gripping my little wooden bird so tightly its wings dug into my palm, a painful reminder of the only thing that had ever been mine. I was stepping into a fairy tale I had only read about in books. Their house wasn't just a house. It was a mansion, a sprawling estate with gardens so meticulously manicured they looked as though each blade of grass had been trimmed with nail scissors. My new room was a cavernous space, larger than the entire dormitory at the home, and it was filled with porcelain dolls with vacant eyes I was already too old for, and an arsenal of frilly dresses that felt more like costumes for a play I hadn't auditioned for. For the first few years, I lived inside a dream I had been conjuring my entire life. I wasn't Ilara the orphan anymore. I was Ilara Davies, the cherished daughter of Richard and Susan. They paraded me at their exclusive country club, at opulent charity galas, and at stuffy dinner parties where the clinking of crystal was the loudest sound. "This is our Ilara," Susan would say, her hand resting possessively on my shoulder. A true diamond in the rough we discovered. I did everything I could to earn my place, to become the diamond they envisioned. I tamed my wild hair into submission, forcing it straight. I learned to play the piano, the melancholy notes of Chopin filling the vast, empty spaces of our house. I achieved perfect grades. I transformed myself into the daughter they could boast about, the living embodiment of their supposed generosity and impeccable taste. They called me their little miracle, and I drank in their approval like a parched traveler finding an oasis, a warmth I had been starved of my entire life. But I slowly learned that their love was not a gift. It was a loan, with interest I was expected to pay daily. The red flags were there, fluttering in the periphery, but I was just a child, desperate for the illusion of a family. Their obsession with their own family history was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of our perfect life. They spoke of the Davies family tree as if it were a sacred text, tracing their lineage back for centuries to obscure European aristocrats. Their walls weren't adorned with pictures of my school plays or birthdays. They were a gallery of grim-faced, oil-painted ancestors with whom I shared no blood, no connection. Sometimes they would stare at me with a strange, clinical expression. "You have such unique features, Elara," Susan would comment, her tone less like a mother and more like a scientist observing a specimen. "It is a profound shame we know nothing of your origins." That word, origins, always hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. It was their subtle, cruel way of reminding me that I was an accessory, not a member. I was their project, their charity case, but I was not, and never could be, a real Davies. The affection I received was directly proportional to how well I performed my role. The cage was beautiful and gilded, but its bars were cold and unyielding, and I was beginning to feel them pressing in on all sides. The first thread of my borrowed existence unraveled when I turned 16. It started with something as mundane as a high school biology project, mapping our family's genetic traits. My classmates chattered excitedly, comparing their mother's dimples and their father's widow's peaks. For me, the assignment felt like a death sentence. When I brought the paper home, a knot of pure, cold dread tightened in my stomach. "What's this, darling?" Susan asked, peering at the sheet over the top of her designer glasses. My voice was barely a whisper as I explained. "We have to create a family tree of our genetic traits." Richard lowered his newspaper with a theatrical sigh. His face was a blank, unreadable slate. "Well," he said slowly, drawing the word out, "that certainly is a predicament, isn't it?" The room grew silent, the air thick with unspoken meaning. The predicament wasn't the homework. It was my very existence. It was my blank past, my empty page in their meticulously curated, leather-bound family history. That night the atmosphere in the house shifted, the air turning frigid. They sat me down in the formal living room, a space reserved for guests and grave pronouncements. "Elara," Richard began, steepling his fingers in a gesture he probably thought made him look thoughtful. "Your mother and I have been discussing things. We live in a modern age. There are scientific avenues to find answers now." Susan leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a strange, predatory excitement. "We've decided on a special 16th birthday gift for you. Heritage kit. A DNA test." It wasn't a gift. It was an ultimatum. Their curiosity wasn't for my benefit. It was for their own validation. They were desperate to know where I came from, to see if my origins were worthy of the Davies name. The hope shimmering in their eyes was terrifying. They weren't hoping to find a long-lost family for me. They were praying to find a pedigree for themselves. A profound chill snaked down my spine. "Okay," I whispered, the word feeling like a surrender. Refusing would have been an admission of guilt, as if I had something to hide. The kit arrived a week later in a sleek, impersonal box. Swabbing my cheek felt deeply violating, a clinical harvesting of my very essence. I sent it off, and for the next 6 weeks, the tension in the house was so thick it was hard to breathe. Every glance they cast my way was loaded with a heavy weight of expectation. They spun fantasies of discovering I was a lost princess or descended from forgotten nobility. The day the email notification arrived, my heart hammered against my ribs. "Your results are in." I called them into the study, and they rushed to crowd behind me, their collective breath hot on my neck. Clicked the link. We all just stared at the screen in stunned silence. The results painted a beautiful, complex tapestry of my ancestry. Southern European, a dash of Eastern European, and a strong Mediterranean current. But there were no details, no close relatives flagged in the database, no neat and tidy story to present. And then there was the fatal blow. A flag on the report in bold letters. Inconclusive markers for deep ancestry. It simply meant my DNA had rare variations their system couldn't fully map. A scientist might have found it fascinating. But for Richard and Susan, it was a declaration of my worthlessness. The silence that followed was a physical presence, deafening and crushing. Susan rose slowly, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Inconclusive," she whispered, the word sharp as a shard of glass. "What in God's name does that even mean?" Richard scrolled furiously through the digital report. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. It means there's nothing, he spat. No records, no matches. It's a dead end. He finally turned to look at me, and the last flicker of kindness I had sometimes seen in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard suspicion that chilled me to the bone. That was the moment the mask wasn't just dropped. It was shattered into a million pieces. My inconclusive DNA had destroyed their fantasy. I wasn't a lost royal. I was a genetic nobody. And to them, a nobody was the most unforgivable sin. The quiet hum of their obsession had erupted into a deafening roar, and it was aimed directly at me. My life as Ilara Davies was over. I just had no idea how brutally they were planning its public execution. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. After the DNA results, the house descended into a deep, Arctic freeze. The pet names, the pats on the shoulder, the thin veneer of affection, it all vanished. I was no longer their little miracle. I was the girl. Dinners were either consumed in a tomb-like silence or punctuated by their pointed, venomous questions about my real background, as if I were a spy hoarding state secrets. "There must be something you're not telling us, Ilara," Susan would say, her voice dripping with acid. "Are you absolutely sure you don't remember anything before St. Jude's?" I could only shake my head, my throat too tight with unshed tears to form words. "I was a baby," I'd whisper. "The only thing I have is the wooden bird." Richard would scoff, a harsh, dismissive sound. "A wooden bird. That tells us nothing." They began to treat me like a con artist who had swindled them into a life I didn't deserve. My friends were no longer welcome. Their cruelty became a slow, deliberate campaign of erasure. They methodically removed my photographs from the sterling silver frames on the mantelpiece, replacing them with photos of their vacations, their friends' children, even their prize-winning roses. The message was brutally clear. You do not belong here. But the final, soul-crushing blow came a few months later. It was the night of the annual museum gala, the apex of the city's social calendar. I had always loved it, a night to wear a beautiful dress and feel like a princess. This year they informed me I would not be attending. "It's an adult affair, Ilara," Susan said coolly, without making eye contact. I was hurt, but I assumed it was just another calculated act of isolation. I was so devastatingly wrong. That night, alone in the echoing silence of the mansion, my phone began to vibrate uncontrollably. A friend who was at the gala texted me. "Ilara, what is going on? Your parents are on stage acting so weird." Then she sent a photo that made my blood turn to ice. There, on a massive screen behind the gala stage, was my face, a school portrait from the previous year. Next to it was a screenshot of my DNA results, with the words "inconclusive" and "no matches found" circled in a vicious, glaring red. My father, Richard Davies, stood at the podium with a microphone in his hand. My friends started sending short video clips. Richard's voice, amplified and self-righteous, filled my ears and my silent, empty house. "We opened our home and our hearts," he declared, his voice thick with a nauseatingly false sincerity. "We believed we were giving an unfortunate child a chance at a real life. We gave her everything. Our name, our home, our legacy." He paused for dramatic effect, and I could hear the absolute silence in the grand hall. "But we have been deceived," he continued, his voice hardening to steel. "We recently discovered through scientific means that Ilara's origins are completely unknown. Fraudulent even. We have no idea who this child truly is. Her identity, as it was presented to us, is a fabrication." Susan then joined him on stage, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Our family has a legacy to protect," she said, her voice trembling with practiced grief. "We cannot allow this uncertainty, this fraud, to tarnish the Davies name. Therefore, with heavy hearts, we are announcing tonight that we have begun legal proceedings to have the adoption annulled." Annulled. The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was a word for a mistake, a clerical error you strike from the record. They were telling the entire world, our world, that I was a mistake they were correcting. They weren't just disowning me. They were attempting to legally erase the last 7 years, to rewrite history as if I had never existed. They had publicly branded me an imposter, using my own genetic material as their weapon. My phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. I couldn't breathe. It felt as though I had just watched them publicly execute my very identity. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The story was everywhere. I was the orphan imposter. The Davies were the tragic, benevolent victims. I was a prisoner in the house of the very people who were systematically trying to destroy me. Their lawyer, a man with a shark's grin and soulless eyes, served me the papers himself, right there in the cold, formal living room. Petition to the family court. In the matter of the adoption of Ilara Davies. Petition for annulment on the grounds of fraud and misrepresentation of identity. The fraud, they claimed, was my very existence. My lack of a family tree was their Exhibit A. Had no one. They had all the money, all the power, and a narrative the public had already consumed. They had left me with absolutely nothing. Or so they thought. Because their final mistake was having to prove their lies in a court of law. The courtroom felt like a tomb. All dark, polished wood and heavy, suffocating silence. I sat beside a court-appointed lawyer, a young woman who looked earnest but completely overwhelmed. Across the aisle, Richard and Susan sat with their team of expensive, confident lawyers, looking serene and righteous. They refused to even glance in my direction. Their lead counsel, Mr. Harrington, began his argument. He painted a masterful picture of his clients as saints who had been cruelly duped. He held up my DNA report as Exhibit A. "Your Honor," he intoned, addressing the judge, "my clients Richard and Susan Davies are pillars of this community. They opened their home and their hearts to a child they believed was simply unfortunate. They bestowed upon her a name, a world-class education, a life she could only have dreamt of." He paced before the bench. "But an adoption is a sacred contract, Your Honor, one based on good faith. And that faith was irrevocably broken. As you can see from Exhibit A, the girl's very origins are a blank slate. Inconclusive. She has no history, no lineage. For all we know, she is not who she was presented to be. My clients were led to believe they were adopting a child, not a phantom. On these grounds, the grounds of a fraudulent identity, we beseech the court to grant an annulment and correct this grievous error." My lawyer did her best, but her timid arguments were swallowed by Harrington's powerful rhetoric. I felt myself shrinking in my chair, the shame and humiliation a physical weight pressing down on me. They were winning. They were methodically, legally erasing me. Throughout the proceedings, the judge had remained utterly silent. Judge David Miller. He was an older man with a stern, inscrutable face and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to every word, his expression unchanging. When Harrington finally concluded, a thick, expectant silence settled over the courtroom. Judge Miller looked down at the pile of papers before him, his gaze fixed on my original adoption file from St. Jude's. Then he looked up and his eyes met mine. For the first time I saw something flicker in their depths. It wasn't pity. It was a sharp, focused intensity that made my breath catch. "Miss Davies," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence like a current. "Your file from the orphanage states you were found with one personal item, a small, carved wooden bird. Do you still have it?" The question was so unexpected it threw everyone off balance. I saw Richard and Susan exchange a confused, irritated glance. I could only nod, my voice a strangled whisper. "Yes, Your Honor. I have it with me. It was in my pocket. It was always with me." "May I see it?" he asked. My hands trembled as I retrieved the small bird. The bailiff took it from my shaking grasp and handed it up to the judge. Judge Miller held the bird in the palm of his hand, turning it over and over, his thumb stroking the worn, smooth wood. The courtroom was utterly silent, holding its collective breath. His stern judicial mask seemed to melt away, replaced by an expression of deep, distant sorrow. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over Richard and Susan, now as cold as glacial ice. "Mr. Harrington," the judge began, his voice dangerously quiet. "You have built your entire case on the premise that this child's identity is fraudulent, because it is unknown. You speak of her as if she's a ghost because she doesn't possess a pedigree that you find acceptable." He leaned forward, his voice beginning to rise to fill every corner of the room. "For 19 years before I ever put on this robe, I was a social worker. And my very first assignment for 5 long years was at St. Jude's Home for Children." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Richard and Susan went rigid, their faces draining of all color. "I have seen hundreds of children pass through those doors," Judge Miller boomed, his eyes now blazing with a righteous fire. "Children left in laundry baskets, children abandoned in hospital waiting rooms, children who had lost everything and everyone. They didn't have a lineage. They didn't have verifiable backgrounds. They had hope, the hope that a family would see them, not a name on a piece of paper." He held up the small wooden bird. "I remember the night this child was brought in. A tiny, fragile thing wrapped in a thin blanket on the church steps. I was the one who processed her intake, held her, and I was the one who documented her only possession." He turned the bird over, his finger tracing a tiny, almost invisible mark on the underside of its tail. "I remember this bird, because my own father used to carve them, and this one had his signature flaw. A tiny notch right here where his knife always slipped. I made a special note of it in her file, a unique identifying feature, not of her bloodline, but of her story." He slammed the small bird down on the bench, and the crack echoed like a gunshot. "You dare to come into my courtroom and call this child a fraud?" he roared, rising to his full height and pointing a trembling finger at Richard and Susan. "You who treated this living, breathing human being like a luxury automobile. You showed her off like a prize, and when her history didn't meet your pathetic, snobbish standards, you tried to dispose of her like garbage. You publicly humiliated her. You put her very existence on trial. You did it all for your own repulsive vanity." He paused, his gaze unyielding. "But your hypocrisy is even more profound than your cruelty. While reviewing this case, your name, Mr. Davies, seemed familiar. So I pulled some old sealed county records. Records from my time as a social worker. It seems a man named Richard Davies, born to a family of laborers, not aristocrats, once legally changed his surname to match a wealthier, more prominent branch of the family to which he had no connection. He built his entire life and fortune on a fraudulent name, a fabricated lineage. The second bombshell landed, and the room was utterly silent. Richard looked like he had been struck by lightning. "You are the fraud," the judge bellowed. "Your entire identity is the fabrication, not hers. Your petition is not just denied," he thundered, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "It is dismissed with extreme prejudice. You will never bring this disgusting matter before any court again. You talk about protecting your name. I am sanctioning you both for filing a malicious and fraudulent lawsuit. You will pay for this young woman's therapy, her continued education, and a substantial sum for the profound emotional distress you have so cruelly inflicted. It is your name, Mr. and Mrs. Davies, that has been irrevocably tarnished here today, exposed for the lie that it is." He finally locked eyes with me, and to my astonishment, I could see tears glistening in his. "And you, young lady," he said, his voice suddenly gentle, compassionate. "Your name is Ilara. It is your own. Needs no one's approval. This court recognizes you. Your identity is not, and never has been, in question." He raised the gavel high. "This matter is closed." He brought it down with a powerful crack, a sound of declaration. The sound of my freedom. In that one magnificent moment, the ghost they tried to create became a person again. The second that gavel fell, the spell of the Davies' power was broken. They just sat there, frozen, their faces a grotesque mixture of shock, fury, and utter humiliation. Their lawyer looked like he'd seen a ghost. They had walked into the courtroom as powerful victims, and now they crawled out as disgraced pariahs. The news of Judge Miller's ruling, and his stunning revelation about Richard's past, spread like wildfire. The story had a new hero and two perfect, hypocritical villains. The reporters who had once stalked me now hailed me as a symbol of resilience. The orphan imposter was now the girl who had been vindicated by a judge with a secret past and an unshakable memory. I never went back to that mansion. It wasn't a dream home. It was a crime scene. I walked away with only the clothes on my back and the small wooden bird in my pocket, which now felt heavier and more valuable than all the jewels in that house combined. The fallout for the Davies family was swift and brutal. The high society they had worshipped turned its back on them with breathtaking speed. Invitations stopped. Friends stopped calling. They were unceremoniously removed from the charity boards they once chaired. Their entire world was built on the shaky foundation of reputation, and Judge Miller had just brought it crashing down. In their desperate, cruel attempt to erase me, they had only succeeded in erasing themselves. A few weeks later, Judge Miller invited me to his chambers. The room was warm and lined with books that smelled of old paper and wisdom. He wasn't wearing his judicial robes, and he looked less like a figure of authority and more like a kind grandfather. He handed me a cup of tea, his movements gentle. "How are you doing, Ilara?" he asked softly. "I'm okay," I said, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, it was the truth. "I don't know how to thank you. You gave me my life back." He shook his head. "I didn't give you anything you didn't already possess. I just made sure they couldn't take it away." He glanced at the wooden bird, which I had placed on the table between us. "That night at St. Jude's. You were so small. Seeing you in my courtroom, seeing what they were trying to do to you. It felt like a failure of the very system I am sworn to represent." "It wasn't your failure," I said quietly. "It was theirs." He offered a sad, knowing smile. "Family isn't about blood, Ilara. It's about who shows up. It's about who protects you, who honors you, who sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself." With the substantial funds from the settlement, I found my own apartment and finished high school online, away from the prying eyes and whispers. Judge Miller and his wife, Sarah, became my mentors, my guides, my true family. It was a family built not on status or lineage, but on kindness, wisdom, and unconditional acceptance. I decided to go to college and major in social work. I wanted to become the person I had so desperately needed all those years ago. I wanted to be a voice for the children lost in the system, to fight for them with the same righteous fire that Judge Miller fought for me. My inconclusive origins were no longer a source of shame. They were a part of my story, the indelible proof that you don't need a map of your past to chart your own future. My identity was never about a fancy, fraudulent last name or a fabricated bloodline. It was forged in the quiet, lonely halls of an orphanage, in the worn, smooth wood of a tiny, imperfect bird, and in the fiery, unforgettable voice of a judge who remembered one forgotten child. Ilara. And for the first time in my life, that is more than enough. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.